And while some consideration from time to time has been given to this particular issue, nothing has been done. Enough is enough. It is time to move on this issue, and we are desperately past due for such changes. While some of us may not agree or want to admit it, the average age of a lobster license holder is in the mid-50s, which means some are getting ready to retire. Many of us can see the transition starting now, and because of this, we all need to understand the urgency of what is dealing with. To put it plainly, our young fishermen are not on a level playing field when it comes to purchasing licenses, and this puts them and their communities in jeopardy. As it stands right now, licenses can move between counties. Yes, they are being pulled. Understand this now, Mr. Chairman, or Mr. Speaker. They are being pulled to the large corporations' ownership because of money. Corporations can lay out this kind of money, but the young people and the upcoming fishermen don't have a chance of obtaining funding due large in part to what I call an antique policy by the Nova Scotia Fisheries Loan Board. Jobs and licenses are leaving our community as I speak. We must understand this as well. Removing quotas and licenses puts our community's survival at risk. That is a proven fact. The overwhelming need for a proper lending policy to fit today's need is paramount if we are to keep these licenses here in our communities, a situation, I might add, that will ensure our survival. And I just want to point out, Mr. Speaker, that that was an excerpt from a speech of some 4 years ago. So I believe that the issue at hand, what we're dealing with now, is probably more urgent as we speak. The survival of our communities is at stake if we want to maintain the independence in our communities. And I want to also put out to the members of this particular House that this issue has been fought, has been dealt with for 3 decades. It's something that is important. It's something that needs to be addressed. I hope that I have all the support of all the members in this House. I can assure you, Mr. Speaker, that the fishing industry will be paying attention. We may feel that we're in a sleepy time of the summer when not much attention is going to be consumed or addressed to this particular time in the House, but I can assure you, and the members present, that the fishing industry will be listening to the outcome of this particular bill. And at this time, Mr. Speaker, I move that the second reading of this particular bill.
The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to stand and speak on this bill. This is a very important bill for the fishing industry in Nova Scotia, and it's unfortunate it took a lawsuit to make it possible in the province. I know when I was fisheries minister before, one of the biggest issues was we had a father and son operation. The son simply could not afford to buy the operation from his father and continue the family business that might have been in the family for many, many generations. And that was very unfortunate. And you see now that if the loan board can move forward and make some even partial loans towards buying these licenses and help a family or even a young fisherman that maybe's helped somebody for a number of years in order to get the time in to become a professional fisherman and provide that solid income for his family well into the future. It's solid for our coastal communities, and it also should help stop the buying up of licenses by fish plants that then control them, and then the people are just employees of the fish plant that actually fish them and don't have the opportunity to make the better income that they tend to make if they're fishing on their own enterprise. So it's a very, very positive thing. It's a bill that we will support, and it's something that, as I say, is long, long overdue. I know when before we talked to many people about trying to get a license, and they've tried at the bank, and they couldn't use it as collateral at the bank at that time, and coming up with that kind of money when you've got a young family and you just bought a home and doing other things that all young families should do. And the most important thing of all that you need to make your life the way it should be, and long-term stability in your life, especially in a small community with very limited employment opportunities, was a fishing license. The one thing that made it worthwhile, and was impossible at that time for many young people to do it. Now, fortunately, some of the people that worked in the industry gave good terms to people to buy them out for all kinds of reasons. And I know I talked to one family in particular, and he said, you know, my son can't afford to buy this license, and I can't afford not to let him have it. So they worked out a financial agreement that was satisfactory to both of them, and it's only fortunate that it was father and son. It wouldn't have worked with anyone else. But how many times has that opportunity been lost in the province in the last several years, where these very valuable assets have been actually sold off to someone else or to a fish plant, and then hires, maybe the person who was fishing on the boat before, hires them to work on a salary basis or per pound basis, a whole lot less than they would if they had their own enterprise. And the individual doesn't have the advantage of running a business-based operation where they can use deductions and other things to help their tax situation, which is so important when you're running a small business. So I think it's a very positive move forward. I'm glad to see the government brought it forward. It's something that if the conditions would have been proper, I would have done when I was fisheries minister, and I'm sure every fisheries minister before me and after me would have done exactly the same thing as would have been placed. So I think it's a very positive move for Nova Scotia's fishing industry. It's extremely important to keep those licenses in individuals' hands rather than turn them over to the big companies. And when the big companies get them, of course, we've lost any independence we have in the fishery whatsoever, and that is a tragedy for Nova Scotia and a tragedy for Canada indeed. So with that, those few words, I want to put my support behind it. Thank again the government for bringing it forward and as under the private member's bill, and the member for introducing it. And I think it's a good thing for Nova Scotia, and once in a while we get to do some positive things for the people of Nova Scotia. Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to stand today and speak on this bill, on what are we today? Bill number 27. This is one that has been, I'm sure, across ministers of fisheries desks probably 100 times, and I'm sure the member for Preston has seen it, and I've seen it, and I'm sure a lot of other ones have as well. And I want to thank the member from Shelburne for bringing this forward and bringing it for discussion once again. And but I do want to say I want to thank the member for Digby Annapolis, who last session brought an amendment to the Coastal Resources Act, which strengthened the issue of asset as well. If you recall at that time, we brought it forward, and it was supported by our caucus. But we were going to be holding that in abeyance for a short period of time until we can make headway with the federal government. As you know, when it comes to a fishing license, that fishing license is held and owned basically by the federal government under its powers under the Federal Fisheries Act. The member from Shelburne references a 25 or a quarter century time since the change with since there was a change with the Coastal and Resources Loan Board, and there hadn't been any change in order to accept any assets. I can say to you and to all members of this House, Mr. Speaker, that the Federal Act, I think, hasn't been updated in 125 years, which gives the federal government the right to issue licenses for any fishing enterprise. Now, if we go back to some of the reasons why there is value in qualifying a license to be an asset, is simply from the extremely exorbitant price of a fishing license, particularly a lobster license in District 34, District 33, in our neck of the woods, the member for Shelburne and I. If you look at a total package, a total fishing package right now for lobster, we would probably put anybody out by $1 million, boat, gear, license, where the majority of that money would be the license. And I don't know what the going rate today is, but you know, last time I checked, it was $600,000-700,000. Why did it get that high? I think is probably everybody's question here. Considering that back in the 70s, and I'm sure when the member for Shelburne got his license, it probably didn't cost him that much. Maybe it cost him a little more than 25 cents than it did in 1968. But 25 cents was the cost of a federal lobster fishing license. $600,000. Boy, I'd like to have that kind of return in any investment that I would put my money into. Unfortunately, we're not all that lucky. But ultimately, there's a whole bunch of reasons, including, of course, the wealth of the fishery and the success of that fishery. The Marshall decision, the federal government getting involved in purchasing licenses because of the Marshall decision for some of the Aboriginal bands in Nova Scotia. And thank you for that time, Mr. Speaker. I feel I've got lots of time to fill in here. And I really don't know where I'm going to go talking about. We'll talk about something else, I guess. And ultimately, pushing up that price from a respectable, I don't know, $300,000 to $400,000 before the Marshall decision was handed down back in the 2000 or 2001. So what it really boils down to, Mr. Speaker, is for a whole range of reasons that we now have a license that's worth far more than most people would believe it's worth, but people have spent that money in their investment in some cases, and because of the lack of lending or being able to qualify it as an asset, have had to find, I'm going to say that in French, had to trouve. Believe that? I'm speaking in French at the same time. Had to find backing, and those backings were, of course, in the form of other businesses, other fishermen, fish plant owners, into what we call a trust agreement. And I think the member opposite spoke a little bit of trust agreements. And if we'll all go back just a little bit now, through last year and the year before. There was I want to call it an investigation, but a review by the Federal Department of DFO on the proliferation of trust agreements and trying to find a way to revert back to the original intent of a fishing license. And I believe it was back to 1982 with the trying to remember the name of that act or the actual regulation that went with it that Romeo Lobaw brought in when he was Minister of Fisheries. Owner-operator is basically the feel. And thank you for the member from Pictou West. And basically to make sure that fishermen, for the most part, are the beneficiaries or the primary workers on those vessels. Mr. Speaker, of course, as we look at the different fisheries that this brings into implementation, there are different ones that probably shouldn't be under those kinds of regulations. There's some that should. And I think one of the last ones that requires further investigation, further look, and there's a whole bunch of sides to this story. And that's the part that I find troubling, because you'll have some people that look at having a trust agreement and the owner-operator issue in Southwest to be a good thing. And there are those in the South fishery in the Southwest to be the bane of his existence. So being a populist kind of person, I believe somewhere in the middle is probably where the line is and where we should be living. And one that I pushed forward as I was Minister of Fisheries for 3 years, and brought to a federal provincial table on a regular basis, talking about trust agreements, talking about owner-operator, and making sure that the interests of all fishermen in Southwest and right across Nova Scotia were brought into consideration before one decision of going one way or another was taken, because there will be some repercussions to going one way or another. And I think the spirit of this bill brought forward by the member from Shelburne brings into that feeling of finding one more step into having this discussion of trust agreements and owner-operator, giving one more mechanism to allow regular fishermen, new fishermen, to be able to purchase a license with help from the Fisheries Loan Board. Now, as I said, the member for Digby-Annapolis brought an amendment through legislation last year, and I don't recall exactly what the wording is around that one, but ultimately it made it stronger so that we as a province can now say to the federal government that we are ready to make our changes. We are ready through legislation to allow the assets of a license to be held. We need the federal government to move forward on sweeping changes to the Federal Fisheries Act. As I said, it was probably close to 125 years old, which is quite an old act that needs overhaul. But of course, it would need approval of all people in Parliament to make those changes. And I hope through our consultation, through this move today, that the federal government can now look favorably at making those changes and making sure that those adjustments are going to be in the Federal Fisheries Act. So with those quick comments, Mr. Speaker, I again want to thank the member from Shelburne for bringing this issue forward. Again, to the member from Digby-Annapolis for his foresight in this last session. And I just want to say that this caucus will be accepting this through second reading to be debated further in law amendments.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, first I want to say how strongly I support this Bill 27 and the fact that last week I indicated pride in riding shotgun with the member from Shelburne, and I am doing the same here today. I didn't realize that on occasions in the House when you're watching on TV that some people are actually involved in various roles of filling in time, and I guess we are at this moment awaiting perhaps the return of the Law Amendments Committee. So I certainly don't, this bill doesn't deal with fluff, so I'm not going to deal with fluff here. This is a very important bill. It's a bill that we have to support, I believe, very, very strongly. With the fishing industry worth over $1 billion, over $1 billion in export value, one has to realize that there are, in fact, many, many, many millions of dollars invested by hundreds and hundreds of fish harvesters. And the reality is that most of the primary licenses are in fact worth much more than the boat and the gear. And that is something that a lot of people in this province and a lot of people beyond our borders don't realize. For several years, my wife and I operated a bed and breakfast in Lewisburg. And we would have not just tourists, but people from urban areas of this province who would come to Lewisburg and want to know where the fish harvesters lived or where do the fishermen live. And they expected to see some small places along the shoreline. And there is no perception out there of the great investment that we have within this fishery. When we explain to some of the fish harvesters, or explain to some of the tourists that some fish harvesters were offered up to and beyond $1 million, over $1 million for a license, There was a feeling that these people had difficulty in comprehension of this. So it's not an industry of last resort. It's far from an industry of last resort. It's an important, vibrant industry that has undergone a lot of ups and downs, and in some areas right now, I understand or I know that people are having difficulty with various species and what have you, but in other areas there is a robust fishery taking place. And sometimes that robust fishery takes place in a species in one area where the same species is having difficulty in another area. It's a situation where in this industry a lot of money has been made, and these trust agreements that exist, many of them have existed since the 70s, and in some areas, as the former minister indicated, the trust agreements have had some benefit to communities. But the downside of trust agreements is that owner-operators cease to play the role that they should within the industry. And this bill 27, allows fish harvesters to pass on to sons or daughters or crew members. It allows them to transfer with a recognized value, a real value, of what the licenses are worth. It's been archaic that this has not taken place in the past. It's just the fact that this has existed since 1978. 1978, we have had this kind of an archaic system, and it has progressed to the point that year by year, as the value of licenses have increased, the problem has been compounded even further. So I think what we have to do is support this Bill 27, and as I say, it will help fish harvesters pass on their licenses to other people within the industry, and that the companies will not, in fact, end up owning the licenses in greater numbers than they already do. The trust agreements started with sort of under-the-table deals, and they have been recognized more fully in recent times. Everyone has been aware of their existence for many, many years. I'm reminded of a story in relationship to the value of licenses. I was traveling with a fish harvester friend one day when he ran into a woman who had gone to school with him many, many years ago. And she was sort of berating him for not having been a good student. She said, "You were so smart. You could have been anything that you wanted to be in life. You always had something that you had to do. You had to help your father milk the cows, or a calf had been born, or there was always a reason why you didn't have your homework done." And she said, "You know, if you wanted to be, you could have been a Supreme Court judge. You were so smart." And he said, "Why would I want to be a Supreme Court judge? I make more in 3 months than a Supreme Court judge does in a year." So I think there's that realization has to be made that these licenses are worth a great deal of money, that there has to be recognition of them by the Loan Board, and the Loan Board and the department, I believe there has been a recognition of this for a long time, and efforts have been made, and I must commend the previous minister for his interest in this subject, and certainly the current minister has an equal interest in it as well. And I'm sure that this bill will get support from all three parties in this House, because it certainly deserves that kind of recognition. So in supporting the Bill 27, I hope that we can move it along as quickly as possible, and that it will in fact make this industry so much more viable for independent owner-operators. And thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me to speak ad hoc, ad lib on this. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Allow me just a few minutes to speak on Bill number 27, the Fisheries and Coastal Resources Act. And allow me to start, Mr. Speaker, by congratulating the member from Shelburne for bringing forward this legislation. I'm sure he'd be aware that this is legislation that our caucus has certainly been supporting the initiative for the last number of years. I look at some of our members, myself, my colleague from Clare, the member from Preston, who's a former Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture, and all of my colleagues, especially the member from Digby Annapolis, who would be certainly well aware of the interest in this. And I know that both he and the former member from Victoria the Lakes had pushed for an amendment to legislation in the past to have licenses considered as collateral for the purposes of Fisheries Loan Board. And unfortunately, that legislation died with the election, and it did not continue to move forward. So it's good to see that we have another opportunity to bring this legislation forward. Speaker, in my riding of Richmond, fishery remains one of the most important elements of our economy, both the crab fishery and the lobster fishery. And most recently, I'm pleased to say that the lobster fishery, which had been fairly dismal in Richmond for many years, has had a successful season last year and an even more successful season this year, which is creating newfound optimism for that fishery, and again creates the issue at the heart of this discussion, the value of licenses. Lobster licenses in Richmond a few years ago were selling for $35,000 and $60,000. This year you're looking at least $400,000 to $500,000. That's within a few years. So needless to say, even in our neck of the woods where licenses were not very valuable, the impact is hitting home at the same time. On the flip side, the crab fishery has been very lucrative in our area as well. And most recently, I'm aware of one license, which is the license only, no gear, no boat, which sold for $1.5 million. Needless to say, Mr. Speaker, that is a significant amount of money. I'm aware of a crab license which sold last fall for $2 million. We're talking money that's beyond people's imagination. And to expect that anyone as a deckhand who may have grown up with the license holder for years and always been there, the chances of them being able to access that kind of capital is impossible. So it's important with this legislation. I agree with the member from Pictou East, and I certainly commend him for his comments, and I think he did just fine for probably his first opportunity to speak at length here in the House without notes, but his own personal experience in the fishery certainly gives him a great understanding of what's going on, and more importantly, not only his understanding of fishery, but his understanding of the impact on our coastal communities. It's going to be important not only that all parties support this, but this bill comes with a big financial commitment from the government. And when you're talking about, I've given you an example of two licenses, two crab licenses in Richmond County. Now, those two licenses together account for $3.5 million. Those are only two licenses. We've got communities throughout this province where you're going to be talking, the Fisheries Loan Board will be receiving requests for potentially hundreds of licensed transactions. You're not going to be able to do it with a budget of $1 to $2 million. It's going to take significant investment by the government to have monies available so that fishermen can access that capital to buy licenses. So I think it's important that all members of the House, the member from Shelburne, the member from Pictou East, and all members, while it's important to give our support there needs to be a significant financial commitment with this bill. Other than that, it's a waste of time. And right now, we know that the Department of Fisheries and Aquaculture does not have a large budget. They are one of the smallest departments there is budget-wise in the entire government. So out of 18 ministers, the Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture commands one of the smallest budgets of them all. This one bill is going to require, as I said, millions of dollars of commitment. So I would hope that with the government indicating their willingness to support this, the clear indication of the support from the NDP, the clear indication of support from our caucus, that the government is going to be prepared to back that up with significant financial commitments. The other, in that department, to allow for this to be effective, the other issue is I'm not sure what criteria will be put in place to determine who gets to qualify for this funding for licenses and who doesn't. There's a number of unknowns here. Is it going to be based on the value of the license, the type of species, the community where it's held? Those are all significant issues that need to be addressed as well as we move forward with this legislation and with its adoption. Mr. Speaker, one of the things we need to look at as well is the impact that this is having on coastal communities. While I realize that the mayor from Pictou East and I believe the mayor from Shelburne both spoke about trust agreements and how they cloud the whole issue of owner-operator, what's also been happening in our communities, for example, Mr. Speaker, in my own riding, we have investors from outside that are coming in and purchasing these licenses. Not through trust agreements, but people who have significant amounts of money to invest who are coming in and buying these licenses. The problem is then the community no longer has control and potentially no longer stands to get the full benefits of that license. So we also need to have a debate as to how we can better work as a government and as legislators to protect licenses that are in communities. I give you for an example, Mr. Speaker, that I know even recently the lobster fishermen in my community have been talking about how they could possibly pool their money together to buy any lobster licenses that may become available in our community. The purpose being to make sure that those licenses stay in Richmond County and that the benefits stay in Richmond County. And if they can identify someone that can fish that license and then eventually own it themselves, then they ensure that that license stays in our community. So I believe there's been efforts. I believe it's unfair when people target these trust agreements as saying that they are somehow evil or that they are underhanded. I know my colleague from Digby Annapolis gave the example of one family that went through a trust agreement where the retiring license holder only had daughters and he did not have anyone he could pass the license on to, yet want to make sure that his daughters and his family continued to have the benefits of the license that he had had for so many years. For that reason, he went through a trust agreement to make sure that someone was able to fish that license, yet his family would continue to have the benefit of that license. That's one example, Mr. Speaker, of some trust agreements. I'm aware of trust agreements where father wanted to put it in his son's name, but wanted to make sure that the son was going to be responsible with the license. It's a significant investment. And so rather than simply handing it over, he wanted to have a trust agreement in place to make sure that everything ran smoothly for a period of years prior to officially transferring it over. So that's some of the good stories behind trust agreements, and I think it's important that people realize that these are not just corporations that have been coming in to buy licenses. There are also real stories about hardworking Nova Scotians that have resorted to this because of the situations they find themselves under. So with those comments, Mr. Speaker, I do hope this gives us the opportunity to have more debate about the impact of our fisheries, how to better make sure our communities benefit fully from licenses and from fishing activity, processing, value-added processing, all of those issues. But allow me to finish once again, and I certainly hope that my colleagues in the NDP will join us in making sure that the government not only gives support to this, but that they commit in the next budget, I would hope, the necessary funding to make this not only a bill that we can say is a good public policy, but that there's going to be the funding behind it to make sure it actually works, it benefits fishermen, it benefits our communities, and overall, Mr. Speaker, and most importantly, it benefits the province of Nova Scotia. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I too am pleased to have a couple of minutes here tonight to speak here on Bill number 27, the Fisheries Coastal Resources Act, and It's an act that I think is vital to helping to save our rural coastal communities spread all around this province from one end to the other. There's many fishing families that depend very much on their gear and their boats and their licenses to make a living. And I can think in my own home community of fishing communities like Tony River, River John, Skinner's Cove, Caribou, Pictou Island, and so on. These are prime coastal communities that are facing some difficulties because of the hardship in finding capital or access to capital. And when you think about it, when one generation wants to pass on their fishing gear to the next generation, the boat and the gear is worth so much, but it's really the value of the license that is the most valuable part. And I've had several families approach me and say, how can I get access to capital here? I'm wanting to retire, I want to sell it to my son, and or I want to sell it to my helper. In one case, it was a gentleman that didn't have a son, but he wanted to sell it to his son-in-law and his daughter. And compounding the whole problem was the capital gains tax, but really they need to find a way to make it as reasonable as possible to transfer it from one generation to the next. And a lot of people have looked at trust agreements as a solution that when they go to a bank and they're turned down, they go to a credit union and they're turned down, they go to their rich uncle and they're turned down, then where do they turn? And it's hard, but eventually a processor or somebody with a lot of capital comes along and offers to give them the money they need to transfer it from one generation to the next. And sometimes that ownership is going really out of the family, out of the community, even out of the province, and occasionally even out of the country to an offshore investor. And it's not helping our coastal communities one iota. And often it sets up, I guess they call it a skipper arrangement, in that somebody else owns the license, and the person that's operating the boat is being forced to catch more and more fish or more quota in order to pay a rich offshore investor. So, Mr. Speaker, I think it's the right way to go. There will be many coastal communities in our province that will be helped by this act, and I would encourage all members in this House to support it. And I'd ask government to look at what was mentioned by the previous speaker, make sure the dollars are available to the fishing families so that they'll have access to that capital. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I'll encourage everybody to support it, and it'll make for stronger coastal communities here in Nova Scotia. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Shelburne will be to close the debate. The honourable member for Shelburne.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I want to thank all the members for the participation in this particular discussion, this bill tonight.
Including the member from Richmond.
Including the member from Richmond? I'm just, I'm learning.
You'll get used to it.
I also want to point out, Mr. Speaker, our honourable member across the way talked about our loyalties of this particular, in order for fishermen to be involved in the fisheries in the 50s and 60s and the early 70s, that there was loyalties to the buyers at the time, and this is how individuals got into the fisheries. This is why this is so important, because we've evolved and come a long ways, and the capital cost of these licenses is tremendous compared to 25 cents back in 1968. So, Mr. Speaker, at this time I move of second reading of Bill number 27.
The motion is for second reading of Bill number 27. With all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Contrary, nay. The motion is carried.
Bill 27, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 25, the Acts of 1996, the Fisheries and Coastal Resources Act.
Order that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, with the concurrence of the House, I would move that we revert to the order of business, presenting reports of committees.
There's been a request to revert to presenting reports of committees. Is it agreed? Agreed. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As Chairman of the Committee on Law Amendments, I'm Director Report. The committee has met and considered the following bills. Bill number 1, an act to make communities and neighbourhoods safer. Bill number 10, an act to combat the production and use of illegal drugs. Bill number 16, an act respecting a Memorial Day to honour police and peace officers. And Bill number 24, an act to amend Chapter 6 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Agriculture and Marketing Act. The committee recommends these bills to the favourable consideration of the House without amendments.
Ordered that these bills be referred to the Committee of the Whole House on Bills.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as Chairman of the Committee on Law Amendments and Director Report, the committee has met and considered the following bills. Bill number 13, an act respecting safer needles in healthcare workplaces, and Bill number 31, an act respecting certain financial measures. The committee recommends these bills in favorable consideration of the House with certain amendments.
Ordered that these bills be referred to the Committee of the Whole House on Bills. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would move that the House be adjourned and that the House meet on the morrow at 11 a.m. and sit until 9 p.m. The order of business following the daily routine would be supply, followed by public bills for second reading, and then the potential for public bills for Committee of the Whole House. I also would mention to members that there is a potential that, depending on agreement among members, that the committees would be sitting for 7 or 8 hours tomorrow. With that, Mr. Speaker, I'd move adjournment.
Chairman has moved to the House to now rise and meet at the hour of 11 a.m. tomorrow. Is it agreed? Agreed. Oh. We stand adjourned.